Now later, during those years, I read Ken Wilber, his integral theory, discovered spiral dynamics with Don Beck. I began to realize that as my consciousness continued to develop, so did my interpretation of the divine. And so I continued to deepen my understanding of Teilhard de Chardin and evolutionary theory, which helped me to rethink how the divine mystery permeates the universe, the new universe story. I became familiar with principles of quantum physics, which helped me see that we are all connected, that we really are a web of life, that we can live out of a both and world, and that I could embrace change at the only constant. Now, Gail, I may have told you this before, but when I was little, I always wanted to be perfect. And of course, in our tradition, perfection meant no change. So I tell you, it was really hard to start to shift that in me, to see that change is probably the way to perfection, if there is a way at all, and that it is the only constant. So in many ways, these experiences for me were of God. And although not everyone would think they could fit into Catholicism, I believed they could and that they can. And possibly for me, what's so critical in that belief is that I never thought I wasn't given the gift of faith, even though it changed pretty radically in how I would articulate it or interpret it. So during these years, I'd have to say my prayer life was getting a little stagnant. You know, the formal prayers were difficult for me as my feminist and social consciousness grew stronger. My rational mind, my reason, would just argue with all the words and concepts embodied in scholastic philosophy that shaped Catholic thought. My major was philosophy down in St. Louis, and so I was sort of schooled in some of this, but it would just drive me nuts. I'd have to interpret everything I was trying to pray, which really takes away from the act of adoration or thanksgiving, all of our ways that we want to pray. So what I found myself is just sitting daily. Now, I didn't have a prayer style to speak of, and I was committed just to give time to God, because in our constitutions or our rule of life, we were to pray daily. And I couldn't pray all those recommended prayers, but I could give time to God. So then in the early 90s, I found a spiritual director who had been reading many of these same authors that I had. And so she became my annual retreat director for the past almost 30 years. The very first retreat, she told me to bring nothing to read. If I had to bring something, bring poetry. Not the scripture, not any prayer books, and certainly no theology or philosophy text. She invited me to just be. She invited me to become aware of what goes on inside of me. She had the needed skills in both psychology and spiritual direction to guide me through the very challenging discovery of myself into what today we call the true self, what Thomas Merton called the diamond self. She invited me to meet divine mystery in a very deep place of silence, and she set me on the contemplative path. And then I became acquainted with the writings of Constance Fitzgerald, a marvelous woman. She's a cloistered Carmelite nun in Baltimore, Maryland. She understands contemplation in a dynamic and transformative way. And then Cynthia Bourgeot, whom many of you may not have heard of, Episcopal priest, sort of a modern day mystic, a real teacher of the centering prayer, and as also with Richard Rohr in his School of Theology, whose writings were so challenging and resonated with me. Now that was my personal journey, but it became more than that. You know, by the time I gave my address to the Leadership Conference of Women Religious in 2000, it didn't surprise me that I said that many women religious were at an impasse with those in the hierarchy of the church, and all the ways we knew how to respond no longer worked. We had to imagine new ways of being and acting that came from the deepest part of ourselves, from our contemplative self. And in that assembly, the sisters voted to incorporate contemplation as a way to begin to address the misuse of power within the church. So I knew that contemplation could play a role in transformation. And so it was when I left leadership the next year that I founded the Institute for Communal Contemplation and Dialogue. So Gail, that's sort of what drew me to contemplation.